So this talk is about some challenges and solutions for implementing post-quantum algorithms in FIPS modules. It's mainly about MLDSA, also known as dilithium, and a little bit MLChem, Kyber. And so I wanted to discuss some of the challenges that we faced and solutions that we ran into or that we came up with when we were implementing Kyber and dilithium, partly on how to implement them efficiently, and partly on how to test them. So testing that they're implemented correctly, and testing resilience to side channel attack. So for the implementation, we've produced a quantum safe engine IP, which has it's a sort of a classic software hardware co-design, right? So it has a RISC-V CPU core with its own program and data memories, and then appropriate accelerators attached to that to accelerate the various components of these algorithms: shake, sampling, NTT, the other arithmetic that you run into. And I also want to give a brief description of dilithium before we get too much farther into the talk. So dilithium is what's called a Fiat-Shamir signature scheme with aborts. So Fiat-Shamir is like EDDSA. So you come up with, at first, a random value, y, that's not related to either the message you're signing or the private key. Well, it could be generated from a hash of those or something like that, but it's conceptually it's random. And then you calculate something with that related to the public key. So A, this matrix A is a component of the public key. So you calculate an intermediate value and you hash it along with the message to get a challenge value. And then this is you're sort of doing a zero knowledge proof. The idea of a Fiat-Shamir signature is you're doing a zero knowledge proof that you, the signer, know the private key. And you sort of stir the message into the proof so that it's bound to the message you're signing. And then somebody can check, based on that proof, what they want to determine is that you, the signer, went through a certain process with the message and that you know the private key. So anyway, so you calculate, per this zero knowledge proof, a response to the challenge. But then, so for EDDSA, you would be done at that point. And output the signature. But for dilithium, you're not done. And the reason you're not done is that this isn't, the core routine of dilithium isn't quite a zero knowledge proof. And partly it may output a response that doesn't verify. There are some extra checks that are done during verification that might not all pass on the proof you produce, and it's not zero knowledge either. It might leak information about your private key. And so what the dilithium signature algorithm does is they've designed it very carefully so that you can determine, based on a signature, well, is this going to pass verification or not? But also, does this signature, if I release this, would this leak information about my private key? And if it would leak information about the private key, or if it would fail verification, then you try again. And the pass rate is about 20 to 25%, depending on the parameter set. So you try 4 or 5 times on average, but it's what's called a Poisson process, which means you just keep going until you find an answer that passes. So it might take much longer than that if you're unlucky. And there are 4 checks that have to be passed for the signature to be accepted. So based on particular intermediate values in the signature that are checked. So some of them, if Z is too large, then it wouldn't verify, and if R is too large, then it would leak information about the private key, R0, rather than R. If CT0 is too large, it might not verify. And then also, after you're done with that, you have to serialize it into a signature And the result sort of has variable length in a certain sense. You sort of pad it out with 0. So if it would be too long, which happens about 1% of the time, then you also fail and try again. Inside of this, there's a certain amount of arithmetic that takes place, and one of the main arithmetic subroutines is the multiplication of large polynomials. A is a matrix of polynomials, W is a vector of polynomials, so you do this multiplication. In order to do multiplication of big polynomials efficiently, you use what's called the number theoretic transform. So this is like a discrete variant of the Fourier transform. So the idea is that sort of instead of doing n squared work to multiply them with the standard schoolbook method, you do n log n work by doing sort of log n, which is like 8, or in Kyber's case, 7 layers of what are called butterfly transforms on the elements of the polynomial. And you multiply them efficiently in the Fourier domain, and then you transform them back. So these butterfly transforms have like internally like 1 add, 1 subtract, and 1 multiply. In what order they occur depends on whether you're doing the forward or the inverse transform. When you're trying to implement this, you can do it in a straightforward way. So for example, make a 32-bit large wide butterfly unit and call it a day. But it's more efficient if you take advantage of the particular sizes of the Kyber and dilithium coefficients. So Kyber, also known as MLChem, has 12-bit coefficients, and dilithium, MLDSA, has 23-bit coefficients, so they're about twice as big. And if you've looked at sort of vector instruction sets, right, oftentimes you can process more values in your instruction if they're smaller. More of them fit in a word, and also multiplying them takes less work. So to get the maximum efficiency out of this, you want to ideally be able to have an operation that does, say 1 butterfly on larger values or more than 1 on smaller values. So some previous work that we looked at when we were doing this is the Kali processor, which it has a butterfly unit that can either act as 1 dilithium butterfly or 2 Kyber butterflies. And that's it improves efficiency. It's especially efficient on FPGA because on FPGA you have DSPs, digital signal processors, that have a multiplication unit that's about big enough to do 1 Kyber-sized multiplication, but only half of a dilithium-sized multiplication. So you need 2 of them together. So this sort of matches the constraints you have in FPGAs. But it doesn't match quite what you would do in ASIC. So in ASIC, at least at small sizes, a multiplier has sort of the square of the number of bits of input is the size of the multiplier. And so you would hope that since, Kyber is half the size of dilithium that you'd be able to do 4 operations roughly for the cost of a dilithium operation. So that's the approach that we took because we're building for ASIC and not for FPGA. But then there's also the memory access patterns. So the memory access patterns that are designed into these transforms used by Kyber and dilithium, they're designed for software. And so if you're implementing them in hardware, you might find that a different pattern is better. So there are a lot of trade-offs on this, and reorganizing the memory, having multiple banks of memory, which increases the cost in hardware, obviously. And if you use a memory ordering that's not the one that's in the sort of standard, then you'll have to reorder at the end of the transform in order to match its order, or process out of order in order to match it, right? Because there are places where the specific NTT you use is written into the standard, so you have to interoperate with. You have to either use that exact one or do something equivalent to it. A related issue to this is, okay, so what happens if you say we're going to do 4 operations of Kyber size for the cost of one of dilithium size, right? So maybe your arithmetic hardware matches in size, but the memory bandwidth now doesn't. So for Kali, you had 2 Kyber butterflies. They take the same amount of data in as a dilithium butterfly. They take the same number of DSPs as a dilithium butterfly. So they sort of match in both respects. But if you if you go to 4 Kyber butterflies, then it takes the same amount of hardware internally, but it takes twice the memory bandwidth. So an approach that had been used before is to do 2 layers at once. So if you think about how 2 layers of the NTT interact with each other, you plot it out. It sort of amounts to like, well, you do 2 butterflies at one layer, and then you swap the values, you cross them over between the 2 butterflies, and you do 2 more butterflies at the next layer. So by doing this, you're sort of doing 4 butterflies with only 2 butterflies worth of memory bandwidth, because you've got them stacked this way. The memory comes in the top, out the bottom, right? So that helps alleviate the memory problems, but it also requires a very particular reordering of coefficients, so it constrains you in that respect. And there's also a slight disadvantage that, well, Kyber, it turns out the NTT has 7 layers in it, and not 8 for technical reasons. And 7 isn't a multiple of 2, so in the last round, the second layer of butterflies is just sitting idle. So what we ended up doing in our product was sort of to go back to the software approach and say, like, well, imagine that you're implementing the software on a vector unit, say in AVX2 or Neon or whatever. You would read in sort of sequential coefficients into your vector registers, and then perform the butterfly transform on, one whole vector register and another whole vector register, each having 4 or 8 or however many coefficients in it. And then you could write them back out to memory, or you could leave them in the register file and then do it for another pair, and then do the second layer on top of that, and then write it back out to memory. So this is a sort of a standard trade-off that we already see in software implementations. So by doing the same thing in hardware, just having the butterfly unit be 1 dilithium butterfly, or just 4 Kyber ones straight in parallel, but then having the memory handling work like a vector unit would in software. We sort of managed to solve both the bandwidth and the arithmetic complexity of this, and make them match up without requiring memory reordering, right? Because this looks like software, it ends up having the same output order as software, so we don't have to worry about reordering to match the spec, which was based on a software design. And the other nice thing about it is that just as in software, you would be able to flexibly do 1, 2, 3, however many layers of the butterfly you have space in the register file for in a row. We can do, for example, 2 layers, and then 3 layers in a row for the last step, so we don't have to worry about wasting performance due to 7 not being even, for example. So this allows us to sort of get most of the properties that we would want out of a butterfly unit at some cost and complexity. This is just sort of a taster of what you would run into in implementing this. So as with all things, once you remove one bottleneck, then the next step becomes a bottleneck, right? So you have a hash engine to deal with the hashing, then you've got your arithmetic accelerator. Now you have to move the data from the arithmetic accelerator to the hash engine and back. You have to pack and unpack data quickly. You have to implement all these other minor operations that are in Kyber and dilithium quickly. And of course, you have to figure out a strategy for side channel protection and fault protection, which is a new area of research. Come to chess, they have many papers about making and breaking these countermeasures. So then that brings us to testing. So you've got an implementation. How do you test it? How do you test it when you are building it to make sure that you've built the right thing? How do you test it when the device comes online to make sure that it's not broken. This is, well, so what do you want from this? So, well, you want to cover each branch of the computation that can actually happen. Maybe some of them are very rare or even impossibly rare. So you want to at least cover the ones that are not impossibly rare. And also, well, each configuration, you want to make sure that you test. And there's so 3 levels of security for MLChem, 3 for MLDSA. The different levels of security have, in some places, potentially different code paths because the different parameters have slightly different operations that you would need to do, different ways to pack and unpack data. Also, there's raw mode and prehash mode. Prehash with SHA-3, SHA-2. And then additionally, there's the matter of testing your arithmetic blocks to make sure that they do the right thing on all inputs, either formally or exhaustively or just directed random tests. So then you have to implement also on startup or before you use the algorithm a cast, a cryptographic algorithm self-test. Usually it's a known answer test to make sure that your device is working. And when you receive or generate a key pair, then you also have to implement a pairwise consistency test to make sure that the public key and the private key really do correspond to each other. So MLChem, I sort of skipped it in the description of how these things work for time reasons, but it's it uses a lot of the same operations as MLDSA, even though it's not quite the same algorithm. MLChem has a test, so when you decrypt a message from somebody, you're required to re-encrypt it to make sure that it was encrypted correctly. If you skip that step, then you're vulnerable to sort of classical cryptanalysis attacks. So you have to test both the case where the ciphertext is correctly formed and where it's incorrectly formed in your cast. It's also probably wise, I don't think this is actually a requirement, but I'm not sure, to test what do you do? Do you handle sanely private keys that are malformed? So for example, their coefficients are too large. You are required to check in your implementation, although again, I don't think it has to be in the cast, the case where you receive a public key whose coefficients are too large, bigger than or equal to the modulus Q. You should probably make sure that you have the fence post right, and then it rejects ones where they're equal to Q. This is actually not in the any of the algorithms listed in the FIPS spec, but it is in the text. There's just a thing that says you have to check that they're all less than Q and reject otherwise. There's also some things that can happen frequently or infrequently. So usually when you calculate this matrix A, it's sampled pseudo-randomly. It takes 3 blocks of output from shake, but it could take more than 3. It could take 4 or 5 or even 6. Now we don't know any vectors where it takes 6. That's essentially impossibly rare, but it would be good to have some assurance, perhaps by testing with a faked shake implementation that just gives you bad answers. What happens if it takes more blocks? But you should at least, run the test vectors for 3, 4, and 5. So it's a relatively short list of things that you might have to test for MLChem just for the general testing requirements. Also, what's the PCT? So how do you check if your public key and private key correspond? Well, you just encrypt a message with the public key and decrypt it with the private key. So straightforward. MLDSA is a little more complicated. So for one thing, there are, in addition to those rejection conditions that cause the loop to go again, there are some flat error conditions that can happen during signing. So you're allowed to sign with a context that binds the message you're signing to, for example, a TLS session or something like that. That context is not allowed to be more than, I believe, 255 characters long. So you have to check that it's the right length. If you're signing something that's supposed to be the SHA-512, let's say, hash of a message, and it's not 512 bits long, then you have to error out on that. Similarly for the other hashes. And of course, then there's the malformed private key case. When you're signing, so your cast has to cover all 4 of these cases, if it can. There are 4 ways that you can reject a signature when you're signing for either leaking information or for the threat that it wouldn't verify. One of them actually can only happen at one of the security levels. So the test that CT0 might be too large, that can only happen for the smallest security parameter, MLDSA 4.4. It can't happen for the other 2. So if you're testing, the other ones, obviously that's not required. And then when you verify, there are 3 ways that could go wrong, which have subcases also. Z is too big. There's a section called the hints. That's the variable length section of it. You have to make sure that that's encoded correctly, padded correctly. And then the sort of the thing you're supposed to check, the main core of the signature, could just like not match. So want to check that too. So what's the PCT on this? Well, you sign a message with your private key and then you check it with the public key. Pretty straightforward. So MLDSA has, compared to MLChem, more corner cases. Well, one of them is that because it's a Poisson process, you just keep going until you succeed. If your hardware were broken, then you would never return, and that could be bad in some systems. And so you're allowed to error out after a certain number of loops. But you have to go about testing that carefully, right? Because the number is selected to be high enough that if your hardware isn't broken, it should never happen with overwhelming probability. So you decide, how carefully you want to test that. It's supposed to never happen, right? But if you implemented it, maybe you should have a sort of a stub test for it. There's also some other things that could happen incredibly rarely. So with probability about 10 to the minus 30, one of the subroutines takes a second shake block. I don't think there are any test vectors for that, but you could have one with a fake shake implementation. And again, so CT0 can fail for the smallest security parameters, but not the larger ones. The CT0 check fails about 1 time in 125 million signatures at this low security level. And it has to be in the cast, right? So you have to check what happens if that check fails. So you have to generate carefully test vectors that will trigger that condition and have them in your code. So that's kind of a pain to generate. It takes a lot of compute to generate. If you want to do it faster, you can try to generate, you can either use dishonestly generated public keys that have impossibly large values in some of the places, impossibly large T0, for example. Or to get a more realistic test case, you could have one that's merely unlucky, generate 1 million keys or something and pick the one with the biggest T0 that will have the highest chance of getting rejected for a CT0 that's too large. So that speeds up the search by about a factor of 10, which matters even more if you want to do a design time check that you built it right and the test for CT0 is actually in the right place, right? So if you want to check that it actually is at the exact value that's mandated by the spec, then you want to check where it's cases where it's, exactly on the line or exactly across the line. But this is an absolute value check, so actually that's 4 checks, right? Exactly on the line or across in either the positive or the negative direction. So my colleague Qinglai and I developed code to search for these, and so NIST is using that to generate tests for the CAVP. Another thing that has to be in the cast is this hint check. So you there's a step where if you didn't include a little extra information, it wouldn't verify properly. This is called hints, and you're only allowed to give at most a certain number of hints because otherwise the signature wouldn't fit in where it's supposed to be formatted. So the size of the signature as given by the spec is chosen so that about 1% of the time there are too many hints. That's where they set the cutoff to make the SIG smaller, and so that also has to be in the cast. So you have to have a case for too many hints in the cast. And finally, side channel testing. Let me look at my side channel to see how I'm, okay. Yeah. These algorithms are particularly tricky to defend against side channel attack. Maybe not so much as Falcon, but they're both harder than, let's say, RSA to defend, but also they're newer, so the sort of accepted best practices have not been firmly nailed down yet. They use both a lot of modular arithmetic and a lot of hashing. So if you think about how you would defend RSA or ECC, right, you represent a number that's a secret by two numbers that add or subtract or multiply or whatever to that number. So this is called arithmetic masking. And that's an appropriate defense for, let's say, the NTT, along with other things, shuffling or whatever, right? But so you might use arithmetic masking on the NTT. But if you go look at Shake, Shake is doing a lot of XOR, and you could implement it with arithmetic masking, but that would probably be pretty slow. And so probably there you're using Boolean masking, which is to say two values or more that XOR to the secret value, which means that you'll have to convert between those two cases. Either just sort of wholesale, convert an arithmetically masked value to Boolean and back, or there are sort of a bunch of functions that straddle this border, right? So you use Shake to produce some values that you run through a sampling algorithm to produce matrix coefficients or whatever values that you want to be arithmetically masked. And so those conversion functions are places where you have to think about, like, how do I want to protect this borderline function that, say samples a secret vector. So this is also something that, read some chess papers. There's a lot of different approaches to how to do this. MLDSA compared to Kyber is very tricky to test anyway, though, for side channel vulnerabilities. And the main reason is that it's this Fiat-Shamir structure, right? So you start with a random value that's not related to the message or the private key for the most part, and then you do some computations on it. That random value is secret, and then the only way that the message enters in is that it gets hashed later on with something, and then the private key enters in this response step. And so there are these steps that don't depend on the message and don't depend on the private key, and they're secret. But then some of the values that you calculate, so in particular the challenge, isn't secret. And so, you don't have to protect it, but also the algorithm was sort of designed in such a way that you can feasibly, we hope, protect the secret steps. But some of the steps that aren't secret are like basically impossible to hide from side channels. So you'll have values like this challenge C, for example, that depend indirectly on the message. They depend on this highly secret value Y, but they themselves are not secret, and then they'll leak, and they'll also, like, for example, your rejection sampling C. So you're checking, is this coefficient less than a certain value? If so, accept it and do some swap in some step. Otherwise, don't and do something else. So that means that C will affect the state of your branch predictor. It'll affect the state of your cache and so on. All of which is fine. But then when you get to later steps, you'll see like lingering after effects of this. And then in your like TVLA report or your report on timing, you'll see cases where in a section of the code where secrets were handled, something that depends on a secret leaked, and then you have to say like, well, does that matter or not? Maybe it was an indirect effect of this C. So this diagram here is from a paper on the red things are things that you have to defend against side channels, and the blue ones are ones that you don't have to defend against side channels, according to the author. So what we've been doing to try to help test this is to build focused test cases, right? So you want to get full coverage, but for some tests, you make it so that sections that you're not testing at the moment don't affect the answers. So for example, there's a small chance for a given message that none of the steps in sample and ball will reject. They'll all accept. So if you build a corpus of test vectors where they all accept, then you won't have to worry about timing variation in sample and ball, which is a particularly leaky, noisy subroutine of this. You won't have to worry about timing variation for sample and ball for those test vectors. And then you can use that to narrow down on whether leaks in other parts of the code are real or not, for example. You could do this for sample A, for code that rejects in the same place within one of these 4 rejection checks that take the same number of iterations and so on. So this is part of how you would solve this significant challenge of doing, say, TVLA testing on MLTSA. Okay, so finally, a brief word about MLChem. So MLChem has some of these challenges, but most of them it does not have, because, for example, it's not doing this rejection sampling on the whole process, only on certain individual elements. So it's easier to test, but it has the problem that it's inherently kind of weak to side channel analysis, and the reason is this re-encryption step. So if an attacker can tell what you're re-encrypting, or whether you're even re-encrypting the message they think you are, then they can classically cryptanalyze the cipher. The problem is that they can just, with legitimate traffic, they can encrypt a message to you, you decrypt it, re-encrypt it, and then your re-encryption thing is processing a message that they know and they chose. And then they can watch the electromagnetic emanations or whatever of your device. They can profile the device using entirely legitimate operations on the device they're attacking. And then if they can tell, did you encrypt A or B, then they win. So while it's easier to test, it's also got a much harder to defend attack surface than MLTSA. So I'm out of time, and I'm also out of talk. So.
I think we have about 1 or 2. Okay, great. We'd like to welcome Dr. Jake Massimo. Did I get that correct? Applied scientist with AWS, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about post-quantum crypto deployment at scale. So really looking forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Yep, thank you very much. Okay. Okay, hello everybody. I am Dr. Jake Massimo. I work at Amazon Web Services, AWS, and I am on the AWS Cryptography team, which is responsible for our cryptographic deployments, our cryptographic library, and I'm also responsible for the PQ migration of AWS. Okay, so a little bit about the agenda and my talk for today. I'm going to start off with some motivation about how we think about the long term and what it means for the security model of AWS. And then we'll talk a little bit about the contributions that we're making across standards, collaborations, code, and services with regards to post-quantum. And then a little bit more about some recent work that we've been doing for post-quantum migration since the most recent FIPS standards. And then we'll finish up discussing a little bit about how we assess the performance of the impact of these algorithms on latency and availability. Okay, so why do we care about post-quantum cryptography? Fortunately, one of the fortunate things, I guess, about presenting on a Friday is that you're all very well motivated for this now, so I don't really need to speak too much to this, but I'll still give a background on this in terms of the AWS perspective here. So, of course, our long-term view is that we want to use post-quantum cryptography to protect our customer data. And our primary concern here is, of course, the quantum computing threat, the kind of harvest now and decrypt later style attack. And I've depicted this just very simply at the bottom here. Essentially, what we're worried about is people that sit outside or as attackers sitting outside of an AWS data center on an AWS endpoint, and absorbing and recording all of the traffic, all of the open communication. Maybe it's over TLS, maybe it's over a different protocol, and just storing that and waiting, obviously until a cryptographically relevant quantum computer arrives, at which point they can retroactively decrypt that data and recover secret material. The other reason why we care about post-quantum cryptography is that recently the U.S. government passed the Bill 7535, the quantum Quantum Computer Preparedness Act, which creates the requirement for government agencies to have a cryptographic inventory and plans to migrate to PQC. And these requirements extend to information technology providers such as AWS. So in order for the government and government customers or high assurance customers to migrate, then we need to do the same. The NSA has also announced the Commercial National Security Algorithm Suite, CNSA 2.0, that mandates and poses pretty aggressive timelines for cloud providers to migrate to post-quantum security, especially those that wish to support national security systems. And they have timelines of PQ by 2025 and exclusively PQ by 2033. So our customers are reading those documents and starting to reach out to us about what are we doing about this and how is AWS planning to migrate to post-quantum security. So what does post-quantum migration really mean for AWS, right? We often use the shared responsibility model at AWS to describe how we think about the onus of security, which is depicted here. The top section of this diagram, the part in blue, is what we call the security in the cloud, and the bottom section in orange is what we call security of the cloud. So while AWS provides the tools to do so, the customer is really responsible for the top half of this diagram. They're responsible for their data, for configurations within AWS, identity management, server-side encryption, setting up their network encryption, things like that. Whereas the bottom half of this diagram really just represents the back-end work that we have to do on behalf of the customers to maintain our security posture. So for PQ migration, we obviously have to target both sections of this, top and bottom, by upgrading and augmenting our back-end with PQ security while providing the ability for the customer to make all the blue parts up top PQ as well. And the area that we're most focused on is the long-term security of our customers' data. So, and the place that we're most concerned about that is data that's being communicated to AWS over open networks, like the internet. And so this diagram really highlights the many ways that customers can connect with Amazon Web Services. The outer blue ring is sort of the client-side connections that we provide, SDKs, client-side connections, and the inner orange ring kind of represents our end of those connections, our endpoints, our TLS endpoints, our SSH endpoints, things like that. And the good news is that these connections are all using publicly defined standards by the IETF, protocols like TLS, SFTP, SSH, and IPsec. And while we are in the process of evaluating these connections and developing the necessary standards to do post-quantum on these connections and testing them within our infrastructure. And some of those I'll speak a little bit about today. So how does this really play out in practice, right? Like how does AWS migrate to post-quantum? So first we work with the particular service that we want to enable PQ in, and we introduce the new PQ algorithm into our cryptographic library, which is AWS libcrypto, which I'll talk a little bit about in this talk. And then we have to enable, step 2 is enabling the PQ algorithm within the service itself. So this is kind of on the service side. And then on the client side, we have to also introduce the algorithm to the client or the AWS SDK that is communicating with AWS in this case. And then it's kind of the customer's turn, right? The customer can then configure the PQ algorithm either within the client or the SDK to use with the AWS service if it's not already enabled by default. So for example, this part may be selecting a cipher suite negotiation with TLS that includes post-quantum algorithms in that policy. Okay, so a little recap on post-quantum AWS. I'll talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing so far since I've been at Amazon over the past 5 years or so. So we have been primarily working in 5 areas of innovation over the last 10 years, starting with the ETSI, the European Telecommunication Standard Institute, and as well as on their quantum safe cryptography initiative, as well as with NIST. We are at AWS co-authors on all of the algorithms of FIPS 203, 204, and 205. And we have been deeply engaged with the NIST post-quantum PQC, post-quantum selection process from its inception. We even incorporated some of the candidate algorithms from the process into hybrid TLS connections to AWS 5 years ago to kind of help support the process and show industry involvement and a commitment to the process. We've also been focused on the protocols that are being used, or these algorithms are being used in. So these are really how our customers are going to connect to AWS over our networks. And so we've been leading the work on PQTLS, starting with TLS 1.2 and now TLS 1.3. We've also been working on PQSSH, which many of you may just think as perhaps the way that you connect to your EC2 instance. But of course, SSH is, under the hood, is used in the administration of a lot of back-end networking equipment. So this is kind of a little piece of security in the cloud and of the cloud as well. We've also been looking at PQ hybrid public key encryption, a kind of replacement for RSA blob encryption in the PQ world. And we've been working with the IETF on PQ signatures for chems and MLDSA in X509. My colleague Panos Kampanakis has also been working through the NCCOE on PQ Quick. And speaking of the NCCOE, of course, we're always looking to collaborate with academia, industry, and has been focusing on many initiatives such as the NCCOE, the MITRE PQC Coalition, some academics at the University of Waterloo with the Open Quantum Safe project and the Linux Foundation for Post-Quantum Cryptography Alliance. Okay, but we're not just defining the protocols as well, but we're also building the libraries that implement them. So this is kind of onto our cryptographic library, AWS libcrypto, which has included support for PQ algorithms for about 5 years in S2N TLS, which is our TLS implementation. And PQ TLS is deployed everywhere that S2N is deployed. But it's turned on for our most security sensitive cryptographic services. So right now, we have it on for KMS, Key Management Service, AWS Certificate Manager, and AWS Secrets Manager. Okay. So a little bit more about the timeline of PQ hybrid TLS at AWS. So back in 2019, as I said, we first launched hybrid support for PQ TLS for connecting to KMS. This was back including Bike and Psych and Kyber, and unfortunately, Psych kind of dropped out the process, and Bike is still within the process. But that was back in 2019 when things were a little bit different. In 2022, we added support for AWS Secrets Manager for PQ TLS, and in 2023, we kind of followed up and as the NIS process was maturing, we kind of aligned and consolidated for an on-standard tracks PQ TLS for KMS, ACM, and Secrets Manager. And more recently, just last month, we've opened a PR to support standardized PQ, which is now ML-Chem, in PQ TLS and S2N TLS. So far I've spoken a lot about the connections to the cloud, but what about the back end, the security of the cloud? The majority of my work over the past year or so has been kind of inventory and planning the migration of our internal services. So from the Quantum Computer Cybersecurity Preparedness Act, we know that our most security conscious customers have an expectation that AWS will have an inventory and a migration plan. But the migration of AWS is a big beast, right? AWS has over 200 fully featured services, a wide range of technologies for industries and multiple use cases. So it really hasn't been the easiest mechanism to create, but I'd like to give you a little bit of insight about how we're doing this at AWS. So starting on this kind of clockwork cycle from the top here, the first thing we do is examine the service, right? And what this really means and what we're doing really is kind of systematically itemizing each key. Now I don't mean like each individual key that's coming out or being produced by the service. I kind of mean like the key hierarchy, right? If we can model the service in terms of the key hierarchy, then we really have a good idea of the entire cryptographic structure of that service. So for each key that's being used in the service, we'll be looking at its type, like what algorithm is it using, and which mode is it in. We'll be kind of categorizing how the key is generated, how it's stored, how it's rotated. And so then when we start thinking about how we can migrate this to quantum safe or post-quantum safe cryptography, Then we start to look at, how is this key used, right? Is it just an AES key that we don't really need to worry about? Or is it an AES key that was generated from a KDF, that was generated from an input from a customer into the HSM, which was encrypted by an RSA 2048 certificate, right? So even though that AES key may not be quantum vulnerable itself, it was placed onto that device in a quantum vulnerable manner. So we're kind of thinking about how the key is used. Is it used in key exchange? Is it used in SSH? Is it used in TLS? And then we start to look at standardized PQ protocols that we can start to think about migrating to. So once we've kind of, if those standards don't exist, then of course you can see our prior work with the IETF to kind of get that ball rolling and get that initiative going. Next, on to the bottom section there, the actual algorithm itself. So again, we'll be thinking about supply and chain dependencies here. So like I said previously, it's kind of the entire supply chain of that particular key. How did it get onto that device? And was there a mechanism in that kind of hierarchy that has a quantum vulnerability to it? Was it RSA backed? Was it done via an RSA key exchange or something like that? And then we can start thinking about actual security levels or parameters, which version of MLChem or which like security level of MLChem makes sense to use for that particular algorithm. And then it's on to library selection. So we look at what implementation is currently being used within the service. We think about things like, is FIPS important for that service? Does the library already support a library? Sorry, does the service already use a library that supports PQ? Or do we have to migrate it onto our cryptographic library, AWS libcrypto? And do we have to add the particular algorithm to that library and kind of keep going around this loop? Okay, so now onto some more recent work on PQC migration, and this is kind of post the finalized NIST standards that came out just recently. So what have we been up to? So firstly, I'll just introduce for those who aren't aware, our cryptographic library, AWS libcrypto, or AWS LC, I might call it often, which is just a general purpose cryptographic library that's maintained by the AWS cryptography team for AWS and their customers. It's based on code from Boring SSL, Google's Boring SSL, and the OpenSSL project. In fact, it's a fork of Boring SSL, which is itself a fork of OpenSSL. So there's a lot of shared code and stuff around there. It is FIPS 143 certified. We actually got our certificate here at the conference just earlier this week. So what are we doing in libcrypto right now? Right, we are continually adding to the FIPS validated functionality in libcrypto. If you look through our recent public GitHub history, you'll see a flurry of activity since the NIST finalized standards, particularly around MLChem. So we've been prioritizing FIPS standardization of MLChem so that we can deprecate the pre-standard versions of Kyber within our current deployments and work towards that FIPS validated MLChem at all TLS or all AWS endpoints. We've also been doing some other work on ED 25519, RSA, ECDSA with SHA-3, KBKDF and KDA, but they're not post-quantum algorithms, so not the topic of this talk today. So some reflections on some of that FIPS work so far. I've personally been involved with it, so at a good place to kind of reflect on it. I'm sure many of you are already aware, FIPS certifications are costly and pretty timely to produce, to say it pretty politely. NIST simultaneously publishing the FIPS specification and the ACVP test vectors vastly really reduced the certification process on our end, on the development and the FIPS validation of MLChem on our end. But really, we've been thinking about, what else can we do to kind of streamline this process? And the kind of areas that we think need the most attention are that kind of gap between the work that happens after the vendors have to submit and the timeline for the lab to issue the FIPS certificate. And so we'd really love to welcome some and be involved in perhaps some new initiatives with NIST to kind of help pick up and speed up that process to reduce the time to market of these new algorithms so we can start getting them out there and as quick as possible. Okay, so as a cloud provider, two metrics that we kind of we have to live by after security, of course, is availability and latency, right? If you're using Amazon Web Services and we are suddenly taking in these new algorithms with bigger keys, maybe more computational kind of requirements, that we're used to, then what's going to happen to our network? What's going to happen to the way that you guys use AWS? So we're continually assessing the impact of our services and our network with the addition of new algorithms. And I'll talk a little bit about this over the next couple of slides. So first, I actually want to talk about something that we don't think about too often, but the kind of the asymmetry in these new chems. Lily gave a great talk earlier this week where she spoke about how chems don't really act like traditional key exchanges. You know, it's kind of on it's on one of the parties to do the encapsulation or the key generation, not both in most cases. So we've been looking at benchmarks to kind of that differentiates the client's operation versus the server operations, because if you use AWS on maybe a restrained device out in the field or somewhere with a kind of low computational power, then you want to know how these algorithms are going to affect you. And so really, this graph is showing a comparison of client versus server performance for key exchange time. And here, really, we're looking at relative differences here, not absolute latency. And we benchmarked this on just a pretty standard T2 general purpose instance suitable for like common usages. So obviously symmetric performance for the classical algorithms, but obviously PQ is much faster on the server than the client because the client has to do the key generation operations in this case. But obviously these latencies are a lot faster on more powerful instances, but it's kind of just starting to tease away at the things that we're thinking about at AWS, our client's performance, not just our own performance internally. Another interesting aspect that we've been looking at, and a metric that we've been experimenting with and analyzing, is the performance on lossy networks. Back when people were kind of turning on these algorithms in TLS for the first time, there was a lot of talk about middle boxes like freaking out when they see a big key share, a Kyber key share or something, and just shutting down because they're not used to seeing things so big. So we've kind of been studying how PQ hybrid TLS performs with comparison to classical handshakes, and by emulating and gathering some data. So the data that's shown here is, let's have a look. So the total transfer time when completing a TLS handshake under different amounts of lossy networks, right? So we introduced an artificial 21 millisecond artificial delay to simulate the inter-region latency on the AWS backbone. The AWS backbone is just what we call our global network infrastructure, and we performed 1,000 samples for each parameterization, and the graph shows here the median handshake time for each in milliseconds. And you can kind of see that across the board for 0% loss, 1% loss, 3% loss, and 10, that it's a pretty consistent and expected result of about 1 millisecond difference between PQ hybrid and classical, just pure classical, across all loss rates with kind of no discernible effect. We only really start to see differences when we're looking at the highest percentiles and under extreme loss. Another interesting aspect to look at is looking at the kind of latency share of the PQ algorithms within this handshake, right? So here the latency share represents the contribution to the overall median latency. Again, the 21 millisecond artificial delay simulates the inter-region latency on the AWS backbone. So in this experiment, we transferred 150 kilobytes of data just to simulate a small web request or an API request. And across the median total time of 132 milliseconds, just 4% of that time was really attributed to the hybrid PQ handshake, and 2% of that actually on transferring the data itself. So what, how much of this was really, how much of this latency is due to the PQ algorithms? Well, actually, it's a very, very small amount. Of this handshake, 3% was attributed to just the classical parts, and just 0.8% to the PQ operation, which kind of evidences a very negligible impact across the kind of entire latency of the connection. One more aspect that we'd like to look at here is really to assess if a service is likely to see an affected latency by incorporating hybrid PQ TLS handshakes. We've been assessing the performance of TLS 1.3 handshakes across various platform architectures, shown here x86 and our AWS platforms Graviton 2 and Graviton 3. Now, in blue here is OpenSSL 1.1.1 with classical only cipher suites, and in orange is AWS libcrypto, which is operating in hybrid mode with both classical and PQ. Now we can see across the board that because of the optimizations that we've been making in libcrypto, that really we can optimize a lot of the classical parts down enough to allow for the additional computational load of the PQ parts, and we can even outperform just pure classical only TLS handshakes. Now, I really want to point out here that this slide isn't a comparison between the performance of OpenSSL and libcrypto. That's not at all what I'm trying to do here. In fact, OpenSSL 3.0 has made very similar improvements to the classical algorithms and the performance, and it even outperforms AWS libcrypto in some dimensions that I'm not really reflecting here. The point of this graph really is just to show that hybrid doesn't have to be slower than the performance that we've been used to for key exchange for the past 20 years by just kind of picking a suitable OpenSSL like version from the last 20 years. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up with some closing thoughts and perspectives on some of this PQ migration work here at AWS. The key kind of takeaways for us here is that we are prioritizing the long-term confidentiality of our customer data, and the way that we're doing that is executing on PQC migration for our customers. We believe that adoption will accelerate with now the completion of the FIPS standards, and kind of now that they've been unlocked, all the IETF standards can now really start to get the ball rolling, because we were waiting a lot on OIDs and things like that in the IETF. But we could further kind of improve this and streamline this process between vendor submit and FIPS certification by improving some of these steps with the FIPS validation work in the middle there. But the kind of overall kind of takeaway picture is, how much is AWS going to change in the face of these new PQ algorithms? Many use cases will migrate without a noticeable impact, which is obviously what we're always aiming for our customers. Okay, I'm done there. I'm out of slides as well. So thank you very much for listening. Contact details are available on this slide, and we have kind of a landing page, a post-quantum landing page, where you can find out more details. And if you wanted to look at any more of that data or any of those graphs that I've shown, we have publications included on that you can look into more yourselves. So thank you very much for listening.
Great presentation. Anyone have any questions? Please come up. I think we've a lot of good content there. Great.
Hello.
Hey, thanks for the talk. Quick question. In one of your slides, you had like the progression of AWS's use of hybrid, and then what's your thought now for hybrid, key exchange, that sort of stuff, as standards are in place?
Yeah.
And the debate about how do you hedge going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the work on hybrid TLS was really some of the first large use cases of hybrid mode cryptography that we saw out there, and we've always been of the perspective of security is day zero for AWS. So we always want to lean on the classical algorithms and the dependency on the classical algorithms in the face of some problems and some flaws in the post-quantum algorithms, as well pointed out by Dan's presentation earlier with the quantum attacks on lattices. So we really do still want to continue to use hybrid. That's the approach that we will be continuing to use and platforming. In the panel, actually, just the other day, I never really thought about it before, but I've always thought of hybrid as just classical and PQ. But my panelist next to me kind of mentioned that maybe the next algorithm after might be MLChem and hybrid with something else after that as well. So it's kind of nice to build in this infrastructure now about how we can deal with the kind of hybrid use cases and how we can be carefully navigate edge cases and verification logic and get all that out of the way now, so we can continue to kind of hedge our bets on classical and post-quantum. Thank you for your question. Hi, Daniel.
Hi. So thank you very much for the talk. You focus very strongly on chems. I was wondering where exactly in your priority stack the signature algorithms, MLDSA, SLH, DSA, lie, and in particular those very good figures that you had on the latency for TLS handshakes. I'm betting that those weren't signed by MLDSA.
You are absolutely right. Yeah, for those experiments, we actually simulated MLDSA-sized certificates using beefed up elliptic curve ones. So absolutely, but we want to continually improve those experiments by actually getting MLDSA in there for the computational aspects and the processing aspects as well. So that is work that I would love to be a part of. Absolutely. Sorry, the first part of your question, let me...
So you said you were prioritizing work on MLChem, EDDSA,
Yeah.
ECDSA for the FIPS validated
Got
one.
it.
I wondered where MLDSA and SLHDSA were in the priority line.
Yeah, so far our thoughts have been, I guess on my first motivational slide, the record and harvest style attack is our biggest threat to AWS right now. So far we've been prioritizing confidentiality and MLChem, but of course we've been thinking about dilithium and MLDSA and SLHDSA. Panos, my colleague, is one of the contributors to Sphinx Plus, and Tancred is obviously on MLDSA. So we are obviously deeply invested in those algorithms as well, and we already have dilithium in AWS Lib Crypto, but it's the pre-standard version. So obviously the next thing that we'll be doing is including those algorithms into our cryptographic library, so we can start to continually assess the performance. We've just been waiting a little bit more on the signature side of things because the NIST process has been a little bit more tumultuous on the signature side of things. So we want to really make sure that we're providing solutions that are suitable for our applications, and so we're kind of waiting for those smaller parameter sets of Sphinx Plus and things like that as well. But absolutely planned work. Yeah. Thank you for your question.
Can I ask you a question?
One more question, yes.
One more question, last question, I promise. So, Greta, thank you. Question is about, have you tested anything related to speed of network on classical PQC, for example, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, 5G, 4G, whatever, impact on the larger key sizes, whatever, signature sizes, anything like that, no?
No, not yet.
Okay.
Predominantly, we've been focusing on our largest use cases first, but no further work on like 5G smaller networks or things like that yet, okay. But that's work that we'd probably love to do, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you much for your questions.